Beneath the surface of our world lies a silent kingdom of secrets, ancient tombs, sealed chambers, and resting places of souls who once shaped civilizations. Each time archaeologists lift a stone lid or brush away centuries of dust, they are not merely uncovering bones or gold. They are opening windows into the human imagination, what people feared, what they loved, and how they hoped to be remembered. For thousands of years, humanity has buried its dead with objects that made sense to them. Food for the afterlife, weapons for defense, or trinkets of affection. But sometimes, what emerges from these tombs defies reason altogether. There are finds so peculiar, so hauntingly personal or bizarre, that they blur the line between ritual and absurdity. In these objects, the strange, the tender, and the utterly inexplicable, we glimpse the complexity of ancient thought. Imagine walking into a tomb lit by flickering torchlight. The air is still, heavy with the scent of earth and age. The carvings on the walls whisper of forgotten gods and lost loves. And then, at the center of this sacred stillness, you find something that makes no sense. A severed hand cast in gold, a petrified loaf of bread, a mummified pet monkey dressed like a nobleman. Each object carries a message, though it may no longer be one we understand. In this journey, we'll descend into the strangest corners of history's burial chambers, from Egypt's golden sands to China's imperial necropolises, from Europe's misty crypts to the deserts of South America. Each section will reveal a different oddity, some chilling, some humorous, some achingly human. Together, they remind us that while death may unite us all, the ways we prepare for it are as varied and curious as life itself. So take a deep breath. Let's open the stone doors slowly, step into the hush of eternity, and see what strange treasures lie waiting in the dark. Section 1. Pharaoh's Miniature Servants, the Shabti Army. In the Valley of the Kings, the tombs of Egypt tell stories not just of royal power, but of peculiar devotion. Among golden masks and gilded chariots, one of the strangest and most fascinating discoveries remains the Ushabti, or Shabti, figurines. At first glance, these small, human-shaped statues look harmless, almost charming, but they held a deep and eerie purpose in the Egyptian afterlife. Each Shabti was created to serve the dead in the next world. Egyptians believed the afterlife mirrored earthly life, fields to tend, work to be done, orders to be obeyed. And just as kings had armies and workers in life, so too did they expect servitude in death. Instead of toiling themselves, the deceased could command these little figures to work on their behalf. But what makes the Shabti truly strange is the scale. Pharaohs like Tutankhamun were buried with hundreds of them. Some tombs contained over 400 miniature servants, each inscribed with tiny hieroglyphic spells. These spells were not decorative, they were meant to animate the figures. The ancient Egyptians believed words had power, real, living power. By reciting an incantation from the Book of the Dead, a Shabti could awaken, take up its tiny tools, and plow the fields of eternity while its master rested in bliss. What's even more bizarre is the variety of these figurines. Some were made of faience, a bright turquoise ceramic that gleamed under torchlight. Others were carved from wood, alabaster, or even bronze. Certain tombs contained overseer Shabtis, distinguished by whips and authoritative postures, tiny managers to supervise the smaller workers. It was, in essence, an entire bureaucratic system, crafted in miniature and buried underground. Over time, the belief in the Shabti army spread beyond royalty. Nobles, priests, and even artisans began to include these figures in their burials, not just for work, but as companions, protectors, and magical assistants. In a strange way, they represented both control and comfort, proof that even in death, one could maintain status and order. Archaeologists today still marvel at their craftsmanship. Some shabtis are barely the length of a finger, yet their hieroglyphs are so finely carved that they can be read under magnification. Each one tells a story of devotion, fear, or hope. And while we may smile at the idea of an eternal labor force made of clay, these figures capture something profoundly human: the desire to make sure life, in some form, never ends. Standing before a display case filled with shabtis in the Cairo Museum, one can't help but feel the strange mix of wonder and unease. It's as if the tiny army still waits, silent, patient, ready to obey. Perhaps they still do, in the world the pharaohs believed in so fiercely. The Shabti army reminds us that death, for the ancients, was never simply an ending. It was a continuation, and they intended to enter it fully staffed. Section 2. The Silent Guardians of the Afterlife. The Terracotta Army and its Hidden Oddities. In 1974, in the dry soil of Shaanxi Province, China, a group of farmers digging a well struck something hard. At first, they thought it was an old statue, perhaps a remnant of some forgotten temple. But as archaeologists arrived, the ground itself seemed to open, revealing one of the most astonishing and peculiar discoveries in human history. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers standing in perfect ranks beneath the earth. This was the Terracotta Army guarding the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. Yet, while most people know it as a grand archaeological wonder, fewer realize how truly strange, personal, and at times unsettling this buried army is. Not merely a show of power, but an entire world recreated in miniature, filled with oddities that blur the line between art, superstition, and obsession. The army was not meant for display. It was never meant to be seen by human eyes again. It existed solely to serve and protect the emperor in the afterlife, a realm he believed would mirror his empire in life. Just like the Egyptian pharaohs, Qin Shi Huang wanted control over eternity. But his approach was on a scale so massive, so precise, that it feels almost otherworldly. There are more than 8,000 soldiers, each one unique. Their faces, hairstyles, and even expressions differ subtly, as if real men were immortalized in clay. Some look stern and proud, others weary or youthful. Every fingernail, every fold of armor, every wrinkle on a face was crafted by hand over 2,000 years ago. And this individuality wasn't artistic indulgence. It was ritual precision. The emperor believed that for these soldiers to serve him after death, they had to be real, complete, and spiritually alive in form. But the strangeness goes deeper still. Among the soldiers stand charioteers, acrobats, and musicians, people not made for war, but for entertainment. They were buried alongside the army, perhaps to keep the emperor amused through eternity. Archaeologists also found terracotta birds and bronze cranes, arranged as if in a tranquil garden. There were entire underground stables with life-sized clay horses, even remnants of weapons that were once sharpened and ready for battle. And then there's the emperor's actual tomb, which remains sealed to this day. Ancient texts describe it as a vast underground palace, rivers of liquid mercury flowing between jeweled islands, stars painted on the ceiling, pearls for light, and automatons that could move or sing. Mercury has indeed been detected in the soil, suggesting that this legend might be frighteningly true. The tomb itself is said to be so heavily booby-trapped with ancient mechanisms that no archaeologist dares to open it yet. One of the most haunting aspects of this entire burial complex is what it cost. Not in gold, but in lives. Historical records claim that over 700,000 laborers worked on the project for decades, and many are believed to have been buried alive to keep the tomb's secrets safe. The emperor's obsession with immortality drove him to madness. He searched endlessly for elixirs of life, consuming toxic mercury potions that ironically hastened his death. When he finally died, his followers tried to preserve his power as he wished, even in decay. According to one account, as the funeral procession carried his body across the land, they noticed the stench of death. To disguise it, they ordered carts filled with rotting fish to follow, so that no one would suspect their emperor had already passed. It's a small, eerie detail, but it captures the surreal devotion his people had to maintaining illusion, even in death. What's strange about the terracotta army isn't just its size or craftsmanship, it's the psychology behind it. It tells us how deeply ancient rulers feared being powerless, how they tried to take every comfort of life, every servant, every soldier, even every song with them into eternity. Death was not a mystery to them. It was a continuation of bureaucracy, a kingdom beneath the soil that required management and loyalty. And yet, despite all this grandeur, when you stand among the ranks of the terracotta army today, what you feel most is silence. The kind of silence that hums with the presence of something ancient and human. Each soldier stares straight ahead, patient and unblinking, their paint long faded, their weapons rusted away. Many were shattered by time or earthquakes and later painstakingly restored. A reminder that even eternal empires eventually crumble. There's also something deeply poetic in how the soldiers were rediscovered. For 2,000 years, they waited beneath the earth, unseen, undisturbed. Generations of farmers plowed fields above their heads, never knowing that an entire ghostly army slept below. And when they finally emerged, blinking into the light, they seemed almost alive again, as if still waiting for the emperor's next command. Some modern researchers even suggest that there may be hidden chambers still buried near the site. Places filled not just with soldiers, but with strange mechanical birds, models of palaces, or written scrolls that could tell us more about ancient Chinese cosmology. But so far, these chambers remain untouched, perhaps wisely so. For as one archaeologist once said, "We have already disturbed enough spirits." The terracotta army is often described as a masterpiece of ancient engineering. But when you look closer, it feels like something far more intimate, a reflection of one man's impossible dream, to never die, to command forever, to have the world follow him even into darkness. In the end, the emperor who sought immortality was buried beneath a silent host of clay. And somehow, through that very act, he achieved a strange form of it. His soldiers still stand. His name still echoes. His empire may be gone, but his afterlife endures, frozen in terracotta, untouched by time. Section 3. The Vampire Graves of Eastern Europe, when fear was buried beneath the soil. In the quiet countryside of Eastern Europe, where mist hangs low over ancient villages and the earth smells of rain and iron, Archaeologists have uncovered graves that whisper of a very different kind of fear. Not royal tombs filled with gold, not sacred chambers meant for gods, but burials of terror. Bodies bound, mutilated, or pinned down by stones and stakes. The so-called vampire graves. It sounds like something born from folklore, from fireside tales meant to frighten children. But the truth is far stranger. Between the 10th and 18th centuries, real people across Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and even parts of England buried their dead in ways that seem almost ritualistic, violent, and deeply afraid. The reason? They believed the corpses might rise again. It began with unexplained things, plagues that swept through towns, livestock that died without reason, or illnesses that seemed to spread after a funeral. People didn't understand bacteria or contagion. So when tragedy struck, the villagers looked toward the graves. And there, in the stillness of the night, they imagined restless spirits clawing their way out, bringing death with them. One of the most famous discoveries was made in Drosko, Poland, where archaeologists found several skeletons buried with sickles pressed tightly across their necks. These weren't tools placed for work. They were weapons meant to hold the dead in place. If the corpse tried to rise, the curved blade would decapitate it instantly. In another grave, a heavy stone was forced into the mouth of the deceased to stop it from biting. Elsewhere, in Bulgaria, several skeletons were discovered with iron rods or stakes driven through their hearts, the earliest known examples of vampire defense. In one, the stake had pierced the ribs so forcefully that it cracked the bones. The people who buried these bodies weren't cruel, they were terrified. To them, this wasn't superstition, it was protection. There was even method to their madness. Those suspected of becoming vampires often shared certain traits. They might have been strangers, loners, or people who had died in unusual circumstances. Sometimes they were simply those who hadn't decayed quickly, a result of the soil or temperature. But to medieval minds, it meant one thing: the body was still alive in spirit. And when graves were reopened, as they often were during times of crisis, villagers sometimes found bodies that seemed preserved, nails and hair appearing longer, a post-mortem illusion, or dark fluid at the mouth. They didn't know it was decomposition. They thought it was blood. So they took action: staking, decapitation, or burning. One particularly haunting case comes from Venice, Italy, in a 16th century mass grave of plague victims. There, among the bones, archaeologists found the skeleton of a woman with a brick wedged firmly between her jaws. The purpose? To stop her from chewing through her burial shroud, an act medieval people believed the undead could do, slowly consuming their own clothes before turning their hunger toward the living. They called her the Vampire of Venice. Another chilling custom involved pinning the dead with large stones placed on the chest, arms, or legs, or burying them face down. The belief was that if the corpse tried to rise, it would be trapped or disoriented. In some Slavic villages, the suspected vampire was even buried outside the cemetery walls, near crossroads or rivers, so its spirit would lose its way. But what's truly fascinating is how universal this fear was. From northern England to the Balkans, from Germany to Greece, similar practices appear again and again: stones in mouths, nails through skulls, bodies tied with rope. Even cultures separated by hundreds of miles seemed to share the same instinct, that death was not always final, and that something might walk again in the dark. When modern archaeologists uncover these graves, they don't just find bones, they uncover human fear itself, a fear so deep, so primal, that it shaped rituals for centuries. And yet, amid the horror, there's something strangely tender. These burials were not done out of hatred for the dead, but love for the living. They were acts of protection, the last desperate attempt of communities who didn't understand disease, but wanted to keep their families safe. Interestingly, some graves also included charms and tokens meant to guide the spirit peacefully, instead of restraining it, like coins in the mouth, herbs on the chest, or wax crosses. It was as though the living couldn't quite decide whether to fight the dead or comfort them. Over time, these fears evolved into legend, tales of Dracula, Strigoi, and Nosferatu. But the truth, buried beneath those stories, is older and far more human. The vampire graves tell us that before monsters lived in books, they lived in our imaginations and in our cemeteries. Today, when visitors walk through these excavation sites, the atmosphere feels heavy, almost electric. The air seems colder, the silence deeper. You look down and see skeletons bound with iron, jaws forced open with stones, ribs cracked by stakes. And you realize that each of these people once had a story, a name, a family. They weren't villains or creatures. They were victims of fear, turned into monsters by time and superstition. What makes these discoveries so haunting is not the violence done to the dead, but the vulnerability of the living. The villagers who placed those sickles and stones truly believed they were keeping the night at bay. And in their own way, maybe they were. As archaeologists carefully brush dirt from the bones, they don't just reveal history, they reveal the emotional archaeology of humanity itself. Our need to control death, our fear of the unknown, and our fragile hope that with the right ritual, we can make peace with the darkness. The vampire graves remind us of something universal, that death has always been both a mystery and a mirror. And in that mirror, we see ourselves, fearful, creative, and endlessly trying to understand what comes after the last breath. Section 4. The Tombs of the Moche and Inca, Gold, Sacrifice, and the Strange Companions of the Dead. High in the Andes and across the coastal deserts of ancient Peru, the civilizations of the Moche, Inca, and their ancestors created tombs unlike any others on Earth. To step into one of these burial chambers, even in imagination, is to enter a world that gleams with gold, hums with ritual, and yet is shadowed by something deeply human: the longing to preserve power, love, and meaning beyond death. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids or the Chinese mausoleums, these tombs were often hidden, dug deep into desert cliffs, or buried beneath layers of mud brick pyramids. But inside, archaeologists have found something extraordinary. The Moche people, who flourished 1,000 years before the Incas, did not simply bury their dead. They staged a story within the grave. Every object, every color, every position of a body told a tale about who the person was and how they hoped to live again. One of the most haunting discoveries came from Sipan, often called the Peruvian Tutankhamun. When archaeologists uncovered the tomb of the so-called Lord of Sipan in the late 1980s, they were stunned. The chamber glowed with gold and turquoise ornaments, necklaces made of shell and silver, feathered headdresses, and intricate copper jewelry. But alongside the riches were things that whispered of devotion and perhaps despair. The Lord had not been buried alone. Around him lay servants, warriors, women, and even a child, each placed carefully in the chamber. These were not statues or carvings. They were real people, sacrificed so that their master would not enter the next world unattended. Archaeologists believe that one of the most chilling yet poignant figures was a young woman placed near his head, adorned with fine jewelry and ornaments, perhaps a wife, a priestess, or a guardian. Her hands were crossed peacefully, as though asleep, but her presence was part of a ritual meant to ensure that the Lord's soul would be served and protected beyond death. Nearby, a guard dog was buried, symbolizing loyalty and guidance for the journey to the underworld. Such customs reveal a different way of viewing death. To the Moche and later the Inca, life didn't end with the final breath. It simply shifted to another realm, a continuation where status and duty remained. The dead needed food, tools, and company, just as they had in life. So their tombs became miniature worlds, stocked with everything they might need: pottery filled with maize beer, weapons, musical instruments, and delicate textile fragments. The Incas, who came centuries later, continued this deep connection between life and the afterlife, but elevated it to an empire-wide ritual. Their emperors were not simply rulers. They were divine beings, children of the sun. When an emperor died, the living believed that he didn't truly die at all. His body was mummified, dressed in royal finery, and kept alive through ceremony. The mummies were seated upright, surrounded by gold and offerings, and sometimes brought out during festivals, where they were consulted as if they still ruled. Attendants would present them with food and drink, whispering updates of the world they had left behind. Incredibly, during these ceremonies, multiple royal mummies were displayed together, long-dead emperors seated side by side, watching the celebrations unfold. They were believed to continue influencing politics and weather, harvests and war. And in their tombs they rested with lavish treasures: golden llamas, miniature silver farms, jewelry of obsidian and jade, and textiles woven with threads so fine they shimmered like sunlight. One tomb from Cusco, the Inca capital, revealed small clay models of entire villages, tiny homes, tools, people, and animals, as if the dead ruler were being given his entire world in miniature to take with him. Some even contained musical instruments and drinking vessels shaped like birds and felines, as though sound and celebration were essential companions on the journey into eternity. But beneath this magnificence lay a darker truth: the practice of ritual sacrifice. Alongside many royal burials, archaeologists have found the remains of servants, warriors, and sometimes even noble family members who died to accompany the ruler. The reasoning was complex, a mix of love, fear, and duty. Death was not a severing, but a continuation of service. In one remarkable Moche burial, a warrior was found placed at the entrance of a tomb, his body positioned as though guarding the way. His skull bore the marks of deliberate ritual injury, suggesting that his death was part of the ceremony itself. To the Moche, this was an honor, the highest act of loyalty, ensuring that the dead lord's soul would be safe in the afterlife. Animals, too, were frequent companions: llamas, dogs, birds, each chosen for a reason. Llamas were symbols of wealth and endurance, dogs of guidance, and birds of freedom and messages between worlds. Some were even placed facing the rising sun, so their spirits could lead the dead toward light. Yet perhaps the most haunting thing of all is how personal some of these tombs feel. In the Lady of Cow's burial, another Moche ruler discovered near the Pacific coast, archaeologists found hundreds of tattoos still visible on her mummified skin, snakes, spiders, and celestial designs curling across her arms. She was buried with ceremonial staffs and weapons, her body wrapped in fine cloth, her face covered with a golden mask. Beside her lay offerings of food and jewelry, as though she might awaken at any moment and rule again. Each tomb tells a story of devotion, to gods, to power, to love, but also of fear. The fear of forgetting, of leaving the world behind. By surrounding the dead with companions and treasures, these ancient people tried to anchor eternity, to make sure life went on, even underground. And as archaeologists brush sand from golden ornaments and skeletal hands, they reveal not just the wealth of empires long gone, but the tenderness of those who believed death could be softened by beauty. The tombs of the Moche and Inca stand today as silent museums of that belief, golden rooms built for forever, where kings, queens, warriors, and dogs still wait in the company of light and shadow. Section 5. The Everyday Magic of Egyptian Tombs, Charms, Toys, and the Odd Comforts of Eternity. If you picture an ancient Egyptian tomb, what comes to mind? Maybe golden masks, treasure-filled chambers, or the cool stillness of a pyramid's hidden core. And yes, those existed. But not every tomb belonged to a pharaoh. Beneath the sand, across miles of desert, and in the cliffs of Thebes, thousands of ordinary Egyptians prepared their own, humbler versions of eternity. And what they left behind was not only sacred, it was deeply, wonderfully human. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending. It was a journey, a long, perilous voyage through the Duat, the underworld, where the soul faced trials, gods, and monsters before being reborn in the field of reeds, a heavenly reflection of life on earth. So they packed for that journey as carefully as a traveler might for a long trip. But instead of suitcases and clothes, they brought charms, food, furniture, and even tiny figurines to do their work for them in the next world. Among the strangest and most beloved of these items were ushabtis, small human-shaped figurines, sometimes made of faience, sometimes of wood or stone. These weren't toys, though they often looked playful. Each one carried a magical inscription, promising to perform labo for the deceased in the afterlife. The idea was simple and oddly comforting. If the gods called your soul to work in the fields of the afterlife, the ushabti would rise, answer for you, and do the hard work while you rested. Some wealthy Egyptians were buried with hundreds of them, an entire workforce of tiny servants, neatly arranged in little boxes like a celestial toolkit. Yet tombs also held objects that feel startlingly personal: combs, mirrors, and even cosmetics. Both men and women were buried with eyeliner, oils, and scented unguents. For beauty was not just vanity, it was protection. Kohl around the eyes was believed to ward off the glare of the sun and the gaze of evil spirits alike. A mirror wasn't only a tool for grooming, but a symbol of the goddess Hathor, the bringer of joy and love. In some tombs, archaeologists have found small makeup palettes, still stained with pigment, as if their owners might need to touch up before meeting the gods. Then there were the toys, a discovery that never fails to stop time in an archaeologist's mind. In child burials, tiny wooden animals with movable heads, clay dolls, and carved figurines of cats, crocodiles, and hippos have been unearthed. These weren't placed there for ritual. They were reminders of laughter, of a life barely begun. One toy, a simple wooden horse on wheels found in a child's grave near Memphis, seems to carry the echo of a giggle through 3,000 years. Someone loved that child enough to tuck their favorite plaything beside them, hoping it would bring comfort in the next world. Sometimes, though, the items were almost shockingly mundane, things that remind us that the ancient Egyptians carried their daily habits into eternity. Shoes made of reed, baskets of bread, jars of honey, tools for weaving or fishing, all meant to recreate the rhythm of normal life in the afterlife. One tomb even contained a full set of writing tools, a scribe's palette, reed pens, and small jars of black and red ink. The deceased had likely been a scribe and wished to continue recording words and prayers among the stars. Some tombs contained food offerings that defy time itself: dried dates, preserved fish, onions, and beer jars, their residue still faintly aromatic after millennia. These were not symbolic gestures. The Egyptians believed the ka, one aspect of the soul, could absorb the essence of food, so feasting was possible beyond death. The offerings were replaced periodically by family members who visited the tomb, whispering prayers and pouring water for the thirsty spirit. And then there were the strangest objects of all, things whose meanings have long since slipped through the cracks of time. In one tomb, archaeologists found a bundle of bird wings, neatly wrapped and laid beside the body. Were they charms for flight? Symbols of freedom? Or perhaps, as one Egyptologist suggested, a gift from the sky itself? Another burial contained dozens of tiny carved frogs, stacked carefully near the coffin. Frogs were symbols of fertility and rebirth. But why so many? No inscription explains it. Perhaps the deceased had a deep connection with that symbol, a hope to be reborn not just once, but many times over. Even stranger were the shabti-like figurines with animal heads, half human, half beast companions thought to protect the soul from demons. Some were shaped like cats, jackals, or baboons, their expressions both fierce and serene. Others were whimsical, a lion-headed man holding a tiny loaf of bread, or a woman with wings unfurled across her chest. In elite tombs, even the walls themselves became collections of magic. Scenes were painted to animate the afterlife. Musicians playing harps, servants baking bread, gardens blooming eternally under painted skies. These were not just decorations. The Egyptians believed that art itself was a form of creation. To paint an image was to give it life. So, a picture of a loaf of bread could literally feed a soul. And yet, among all the splendor and symbolism, there's something deeply relatable about it all. The combs and toys, the food and pets, the favorite sandals or jars of honey. They tell us that even 4,000 years ago, people clung to what they loved most, refusing to believe that death could take it away. In some ways, these tombs are not monuments to death at all. They are acts of hope. Hope that the scent of perfume, the laughter of a child, the warmth of a home could be carried into forever. Hope that love itself was a kind of immortality. And as modern archaeologists step into those silent chambers, brushing sand from delicate artifacts, they become witnesses to that hope, the unbroken thread of humanity that connects us across the centuries. The ancient Egyptians may have wrapped their dead in linen and placed them in golden coffins, but beneath all that, they were still people, dreamers, lovers, parents, children, carrying their most ordinary, tender treasures into eternity.
Section 6.
Strange grave goods of ancient Europe. Iron, blood, and mystery beneath the soil. When the ground opens in northern Europe and an ancient tomb is revealed, the first thing archaeologists often notice is the silence. Not the peaceful stillness of desert air, but a heavy, forested quiet, the kind that seems to hum with forgotten stories. In this colder world of iron and mist, death was not merely a crossing into another realm. It was a bargain with the spirits, and every object buried with the dead carried weight, intention, and sometimes fear. Unlike the lavish tombs of Egyptian nobles, many Celtic and early Germanic burials appear rugged and humble, yet they pulse with symbolism. Here, the soul's journey was not through sunlit fields, but through shadowy lands guarded by spirits, ancestors, and gods who demanded courage and respect. So people filled their graves not only with practical tools or tokens of love, but with objects of protection and power. One of the most haunting traditions was the burial of severed animal heads, especially those of horses, rams, and oxen. Archaeologists have found them tucked near the feet of the deceased or arranged around the grave mound. In Celtic and Norse belief, these animals were spiritual companions, creatures able to carry the soul safely across to the other world. But they could also be guardians, their lifeless eyes watching for demons or ill-meaning spirits. The horse, above all, had sacred meaning. Among the Anglo-Saxons, a warrior's horse was sometimes slain and buried beside him, an offering of loyalty and strength that transcended death itself. To the Norse, the horse symbolized travel between worlds, its breath and gallop echoing through the realms of the living and the dead. Weapons were almost always present, but not just as marks of status. Many were deliberately bent or broken before being placed in the grave. Swords folded at the hilt, spears twisted, shields punctured. To a modern eye, this looks like destruction. But to ancient peoples, it was liberation, a way to kill the weapon, releasing its spirit so it could accompany its owner to the afterlife. In fact, some scholars believe that every object in those graves had a soul of its own, a quiet, unseen energy that followed its master even beyond death. And then there were the oddly personal items, small yet full of meaning. A comb carved from bone, a silver spoon, a spindle whore, a bead, or even a cup of ale sealed tight before burial. These were not offerings to the gods. They were reminders of who the person was. In a woman's grave in Iron Age France, archaeologists found a set of delicate bronze tweezers and a small mirror, suggesting that vanity and self-care, even then, were expressions of dignity and identity. In a Viking grave near Birka, Sweden, a woman was buried with a ring of keys, not jewelry, but symbols of authority and responsibility, for she had likely been the keeper of a great household. Some graves, however, contain things that defy all expectation. In Denmark, a burial from around 200 BCE revealed a cauldron filled with what seemed to be burned herbs and animal fat, possibly an offering to the earth gods. In another site, a man was buried with a handful of iron nails placed carefully in his mouth, a ritual scholars still puzzle over. Some think it was a spell, perhaps to keep him from speaking curses in death or rising from the grave. Others see it as a charm for transformation, iron being a sacred metal that binds and protects. There were stranger things still. The amulets. These took every imaginable form: bear claws, carved stones, bones drilled into pendants, teeth strung like necklaces. Each one was chosen with intention. A wolf's fang might bring courage, a boar's tusk strength, a raven's feather wisdom. To the people of early Europe, these were not mere ornaments. They were living charms, alive with the essence of the animal they came from. Some warriors were buried wearing belts of bones or teeth, clinking faintly like armor against spirits unseen. Others had small pouches, the ancient equivalent of a talisman bag, filled with herbs, bits of iron, or strange stones said to glow in moonlight. Yet perhaps the most unsettling discoveries are those that seem almost playful, things that blur the line between sacred and absurd. In one burial mound in Bohemia, archaeologists found what appeared to be a clay figurine of a man with exaggerated features lying beside the deceased. It may have been a charm against evil spirits, or simply an object of humor, a reminder that laughter, too, was part of life's passage. In another tomb, a man was buried with a tiny model of a loaf of bread and a cup of ale, sculpted perfectly from clay, a symbol, perhaps, that he would never go hungry in the afterlife. But not all graves were meant for rest. Some were sealed with fear. The revenant burials, graves where bodies were pinned down with stones or stakes, speak to a darker side of ancient belief. People feared that certain souls might return, restless and vengeful. So they were bound, weighted, or even dismembered to ensure their silence. In one site in Poland, the skeleton of a man was found with a sickle laid across his throat, the blade positioned so that if he rose, it would decapitate him. It's a macabre gesture, but one rooted in deep superstition, the ancient need to keep the line between life and death firm and respected. What's remarkable, though, is how consistent one theme remains across these burials: connection. Every nail, bead, and charm was placed with care. Whether it was meant to summon strength, ward off evil, or comfort the dead, each object speaks to the same human impulse: the refusal to let go. To look into these graves is to glimpse hearts that beat just like ours. People who loved, feared, and believed, who packed their courage and their treasures for the longest journey imaginable. And though their rituals may seem strange, their intentions were achingly familiar: to be safe, remembered, and at peace. Section 7. The Mystical Tombs of the East. Jade, Spirits, and Worlds Beneath the Earth. If the tombs of Europe whisper of earth and iron, then those of the East in ancient China, Japan, and Korea seem to hum with eternity. They are not dark places of mourning, but glowing realms built for life beyond death, where emperors ruled unseen kingdoms, and the spirits of ancestors were tended with quiet devotion. In ancient China, especially during the Han Dynasty over 2,000 years ago, death was not an ending, it was a continuation of existence in another form. A proper burial was not merely a sign of wealth, but an act of cosmic harmony, ensuring that the dead remained content and would not disturb the living. And so the tombs of nobles and emperors became vast subterranean palaces, filled with everything a soul might need: music, servants, guards, food, and even the scent of incense to perfume eternity. Among the most famous of these is, of course, the tomb of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, guarded by his breathtaking army of over 8,000 terracotta soldiers. But what many don't know is that the emperor's actual burial chamber, still sealed to this day, is rumored to contain rivers of mercury and a ceiling painted to mimic the constellations. The Mercury, scholars say, symbolized immortal life, flowing silver currents in the emperor's underground paradise. Yet beyond such monumental wonders, countless smaller tombs across China have revealed quieter, more intimate treasures. Some of the most extraordinary are the jade burial suits, shimmering garments made from thousands of thin jade plates, each sewn together with gold or silk thread. These suits were believed to preserve the body from decay, as jade symbolized purity and immortality. A Han prince or princess might lie forever in cool green light, wrapped in the stone of eternity itself. Beside them were placed curious objects, bronze mirrors to reflect evil spirits, miniature clay servants to attend their needs, and small houses, granaries, or even livestock, sculpted in exquisite detail. These spirit goods, known as Mingqi, were not toys, they were offerings of continuity. To the ancient Chinese, life in the afterworld was simply an extension of this one, and the dead would continue their duties and pleasures in a realm unseen. One of the strangest discoveries came from the tomb of Lady Dai, also known as Xin Zhui, found in the 1970s in Hunan province. Her body, miraculously preserved for over 2 millennia, still had supple skin and even traces of blood in her veins. Around her, archaeologists uncovered a wealth of objects, cosmetics, fine silks, lacquerware, and a menu of her favorite foods carefully written out, perhaps to ensure she would never go hungry in the next life. And above her coffin was draped a silk banner painted with scenes of her soul's ascent, a cosmic map of heaven, earth, and the underworld. Meanwhile, across the sea in ancient Japan, tombs took on another form entirely. During the Kofun period, around the 3rd to 7th centuries CE, the Japanese elite were buried in enormous keyhole-shaped mounds, some stretching over 400 meters long. Around these mounds stood rows of hollow clay figures called haniwa. At first glance, these figures look almost playful, smiling soldiers, animals, houses, even dancers, all lined up as if welcoming the dead to their new home. But the haniwa had a deeper meaning. They were guardians, standing watch between the living world and the spirit realm. Each one, some believe, represented a prayer or a protector, their expressions calm and eternal beneath centuries of rain and moss. Even more fascinating are the objects found within these tombs. Some nobles were buried with bronze mirrors, weapons, or finely crafted magatama, comma-shaped jewels believed to hold spiritual power. Others had tiny models of boats, suggesting journeys to the afterlife, or clay jars filled with offerings of food and sake. To the ancient Japanese, the afterlife was not a foreign place, but a reflection of nature itself, quiet, balanced, and alive with spirit. In the ancient Korean kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, the story deepens further. These cultures blended shamanic and Buddhist traditions, creating tombs that shimmered with color and ritual. The Silla royals, in particular, were buried with an astonishing variety of gold artifacts, crowns shaped like trees and antlers, inlaid with jade and crystal, as if the wearer was meant to grow roots in both worlds, the earth below and the heavens above. Archaeologists in Korea have found tombs lined with painted murals depicting not sorrow, but celebration. banquets, hunts, and celestial beings soaring through the clouds. In one, a group of musicians plays beneath a painted sky, as if welcoming the dead with eternal music. In another, a tiger prowls through clouds of smoke, a guardian of the soul's passage. Yet amid all this grandeur, there are strange and tender details that speak directly to human emotion. In one Korean tomb, a wooden box was found containing tiny clay birds, their wings delicately painted. Some scholars think they represented the soul's flight. Others believe they were tokens of love, perhaps left by those who could not bear to say goodbye. Even odder still are the remains of ritual sacrifices, not only of animals, but sometimes of attendants who were believed to accompany their master into death. In early China and Korea, this practice faded over time, replaced by symbolic objects, clay figures standing in for real servants, a shift that showed not only changing beliefs, but a growing reverence for life itself. What makes these tombs so profoundly moving is not their wealth or their size, but their intentionality. Every object, every mural, every curve of a jade ornament was placed with purpose, not merely to honor the dead, but to ensure cosmic balance, the harmony of yin and yang, the peace of both soul and sky. To walk through one of these ancient burial sites, even now, as a visitor surrounded by silence and dust, is to feel something timeless. The echo of music that once filled the tomb, the scent of burned incense, the shimmer of gold and jade still catching the faintest light. It's as if the world itself pauses, acknowledging that even in death, the ancients found beauty, and in beauty, they found eternity. Section 8. Tombs of the Americas and the Pacific. Gold, sacrifice, and the spirit of the earth. Far from the marble tombs of Europe and the jade chambers of China, across the vast oceans, other civilizations built their own bridges to the afterlife. In the Americas, from the dry deserts of Peru to the deep jungles of Mesoamerica, people imagined death not as silence, but as transformation, a journey through the earth itself, into a world both sacred and alive. Among the most haunting and beautiful of these are the tombs of the Moche people of ancient Peru, who flourished nearly 2,000 years ago along the Pacific coast. The Moche were master metalworkers, their art glowing with gold, silver, and copper. But their beliefs about death reveal a culture that merged beauty with terror. In the arid sands of northern Peru, archaeologists have uncovered pyramids of sun-baked mud brick, and within them, tombs filled with treasures and with blood. One of the most famous discoveries is the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, unearthed in 1987. Inside, the remains of a Moche ruler lay adorned in brilliant gold jewelry, nose ornaments shaped like birds in flight, necklaces strung with shells and turquoise, and headdresses crafted with shimmering copper feathers. Around him lay 6 human companions, all sacrificed to serve him in death, as well as a dog and a pair of llamas. The detail of his burial was astonishing. His body positioned carefully, surrounded by ritual offerings, his face still gleaming after 17 centuries of silence. To the Moche, death was a sacred exchange. The ruler's passing required gifts to the gods, a reenactment of cosmic order. And so their tombs became theaters of transformation, where every ornament, every drop of blood bound the human to the divine. Further north, the Maya approached death differently. To them, the underworld, called Xibalba, was not a place of punishment, but a vast, watery realm beneath the earth, where gods and ancestors resided. Maya rulers were often buried in temples built to align with the stars, symbolizing their rebirth as divine beings. One of the most famous burials is that of King Pakal the Great, discovered in Palenque, Mexico. When his tomb was opened, archaeologists found a massive stone sarcophagus, carved with the image of the king falling into the jaws of the underworld, yet rising again as the world tree, his spirit reborn in eternal cycle. Around him were hundreds of jade beads, shell ornaments, and offerings of food and incense. His face was covered by a delicate jade mask, cool, serene, and utterly lifelike. Even smaller Maya tombs revealed a fascination with the afterlife's mysteries. Archaeologists have found crystal jars filled with offerings, carved bone flutes, and painted vessels showing scenes of dancing skeletons and feasting gods. In these depictions, the dead were never gone. They were companions to the living, spirits who feasted on incense smoke and remembered songs. Further south, among the Nazca and Chachapoya of Peru, the desert itself became the tomb. Mummified bodies, wrapped in layers of cotton and woven cloth, were placed in pits or perched in high cliffside caves, gazing eternally across the barren landscape. Many were seated upright, hands folded, their faces turned toward the rising sun. In some tombs, archaeologists found miniature dolls, ceramic animals, and even strings of human hair, braided carefully, perhaps tokens of love left behind by the living. The Inca Empire, vast and powerful, held one of the most sophisticated rituals of all. For them, the line between life and death was blurred. The dead could still take part in the affairs of the living. Mummified rulers, dressed in fine textiles and gold, were brought out during festivals to witness ceremonies, feasts, and even political discussions. Their tombs were less places of abandonment than residences of eternal kingship. In the sacred city of Cusco, the mummies of emperors once sat in golden chambers, tended by attendants who bathed and clothed them, spoke to them, and offered them food. When Spanish chroniclers saw this, they described it as both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The quiet dignity of bodies long dead, still wearing crowns and jewelry, gazing over their people like sleeping gods. But perhaps the most poignant discoveries come not from rulers, but from the children of the Andes. Young lives offered as sacrifices to the mountain gods. On high peaks like Lulajulico and Ampado, archaeologists have found the frozen mummies of boys and girls, their faces serene, their bodies perfectly preserved by the cold. They were dressed in fine woven garments, with small figurines of gold and silver placed beside them. These were not punishments, but acts of faith, gifts to the mountains, meant to ensure the world's balance and fertility. Their calm expressions, even in death, speak of a belief that this sacrifice was sacred, that they were ascending to a divine home. Across the Pacific, the story takes yet another turn. On the islands of Polynesia and Micronesia, the dead were not buried in isolation, but kept close, sometimes literally. In certain cultures, skulls or bones of ancestors were kept in family homes, decorated with shells or woven mats, and offered food and prayer. Far from being morbid, it was a way of keeping the dead present, part of the family's daily life, protectors who listened in silence. In other island communities, graves were made of coral stones, polished smooth and glowing in the sunlight. Offerings of coconuts, carved wood, and flowers were left each day, ensuring that the spirits remained benevolent. The connection between the living and the dead was never broken. It was a circle of care, woven through generations like the endless sea. From the golden masks of the Maya to the coral tombs of the Pacific, the people of these lands turned death into continuity. Their offerings, their songs, their carved treasures were not mere superstition. They were acts of love, rooted in an unshakable belief that life and death were threads of the same great tapestry. To stand today before those tombs, high in the Andes, deep in jungle temples, or beneath desert cliffs, is to feel the heartbeat of humanity itself. Each artifact, no matter how strange or grand, whispers the same truth, that even in death, we have always sought connection, beauty, and the eternal warmth of remembrance. Section 9. Egypt and Mesopotamia, Sacred Curses, Strange Treasures, and Eternal Voyages. When we think of tombs, few places rise so vividly in the imagination as ancient Egypt, that golden land where death was not an ending, but a meticulously engineered passage to eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed that life, death, and rebirth were bound together in an endless cycle, much like the Nile that flooded each year, bringing both destruction and renewal. And so, their tombs were not graves but gateways, stocked with everything a soul might need to live forever in the afterlife. And everything might mean anything. When the archaeologist Howard Carter first gazed into the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he described what he saw as wonderful things. What he meant was a shimmering maze of objects: golden chariots, ivory boxes, alabaster jars, jeweled daggers, furniture, clothing, and games. But beyond the glittering gold were stranger relics still: tiny reed boats for sailing the celestial river, carved headrests shaped like lions, and even containers filled with food and wine, meant to sustain the young king on his eternal voyage. Among the most fascinating finds was a set of boomerangs, some designed for sport, others possibly for hunting birds. Imagine, even in death, Tutankhamun might have planned to enjoy a leisurely afternoon throwing wooden boomerangs in the golden fields of paradise. But the Egyptians were not just practical about death. They were deeply spiritual and sometimes superstitious. Tombs often contained curses, not of Hollywood fantasy, but solemn warnings meant to protect the resting place from thieves. In one ancient inscription, a tomb owner wrote, "Cursed be those who disturb my rest. May the crocodile seize them. May the serpent strike them. May the hippopotamus trample them." These words weren't simply threats. They were seen as active magic, bound to the gods themselves. To desecrate a tomb wasn't just theft. It was a crime against the order of the universe. Still, the ancient Egyptians weren't alone in their fascination with the strange and sacred. To the east, along the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, the peoples of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, also filled their tombs with curious treasures, though their ideas about the afterlife were darker, more shadowed. For the Mesopotamians, the world of the dead, known as the land of no return, was not a paradise, but a dim, dusty realm beneath the earth. There, the dead ate clay and drank from muddy water, their souls existing as faint echoes. To help their loved ones survive in that bleak eternity, families left small offerings in tombs: bread, beer, oil, and incense, the basic ingredients of comfort. Yet even in this somber belief system, people found ways to add beauty and strangeness to their burials. Archaeologists in the ancient city of Ur, dating back over 4,000 years, discovered the royal tombs, a complex so dazzling it still stirs wonder today. Inside the tomb of Queen Puabi, they found a scene frozen in time, the queen adorned with gold and lapis lazuli jewelry, surrounded by dozens of attendants who had willingly followed her in death. The attendants were discovered still wearing their ornaments, elaborate headdresses made of gold leaves and carnelian beads, musical instruments like lyres and harps resting beside them. It appeared that before burial, a grand ceremony had taken place, music, feasting, and then a ritual descent into eternal silence. Among these treasures were cylindrical seals, engraved with mythic images, used to mark ownership and identity even in the afterlife. There were also small statues of animals, lions, bulls, and birds, perhaps meant to act as spiritual guardians. And in some tombs, archaeologists uncovered cosmetic boxes, perfume jars, and intricate combs, evidence that even in death, the ancient Mesopotamians sought beauty and grace. But the most haunting find of all might be the lyres of Ur, musical instruments buried beside their players. These lyres, inlaid with gold and decorated with animal motifs, were symbols of harmony between worlds. Scholars believe the music once played during these rituals was meant to guide the dead into the afterlife, a final melody to accompany them through the veil. And so, even though their afterlife seemed bleak, the Mesopotamians still found comfort in art, sound, and ritual. Perhaps they understood that even in sorrow, beauty was the closest thing to eternity that humans could create. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, not every tomb belonged to royalty. The tombs of common people, though humbler, were filled with equally fascinating personal touches. Archaeologists have found Shabti figurines, small carved servants meant to come alive in the afterlife and do any labor required of the soul. Some tombs contain small toy boats, miniature fishing nets, and even model bakeries and breweries, crafted with exquisite care. The message was clear: in death as in life, one must be prepared to live fully. Even the walls of these tombs served a purpose beyond decoration. Painted scenes of fishing, hunting, and feasting were thought to magically manifest those pleasures for the soul in the next world. One might say the Egyptians invented an ancient version of the vision board, a painted promise of the life one hoped to continue. And so, from the banks of the Nile to the plains of Mesopotamia, the tombs of the ancient world became mirrors of the human heart, filled with the same strange mix of fear, hope, and creativity that defines us even now. In every strange object buried, a golden comb, a cursed tablet, a harp strung for a final song, we can still feel the pulse of humanity, the longing to be remembered, the wish to bring light into the darkness, and the eternal hope that love, beauty, and art might somehow defy the silence of death. Section 10. Europe's Curious Tombs, Ships, Skulls, and Silent Offerings. If you wander through the old fields of northern Europe, where the mist clings low and the soil hides layers of forgotten centuries, you might stumble across mounds of earth that look almost natural, until you realize they're burial mounds, the sleeping places of warriors, queens, and wanderers who walked the land over 1,000 years ago. Beneath those mounds, archaeologists have uncovered some of the strangest, most haunting tombs in European history. Perhaps the most breathtaking of all is the Viking ship burial, where death was not a quiet descent into darkness, but a voyage into eternity. The Vikings believed that a great warrior or noble would travel to the afterlife by ship, carried across cosmic seas to join the gods in Valhalla, or the mysterious realm of Hell. So, when a chieftain or queen died, they were placed aboard a real vessel, not a symbolic one, but a full-sized wooden ship, surrounded by everything they might need for the journey. The Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904, remains one of the most extraordinary finds of all time. 2 women were buried there, likely of noble status, lying among a dazzling array of goods: carved sleds, wooden animal heads, rich textiles, kitchen tools, and even beds. There were also animals, horses, dogs, and oxen, sacrificed and placed alongside them, as if ready to pull their spirits into the next world. What makes the Oseberg burial especially strange is the mixture of the ordinary and the mythical. Alongside practical items like buckets and cooking gear were carved wooden dragons, strange ritual staffs, and woven tapestries depicting what appear to be ceremonial processions or otherworldly beings. Some scholars believe these were scenes of the women's journey to Valhalla. Others think they were part of a pagan ritual, an attempt to weave magic into the very fabric of the tomb. And yet, not all Viking burials were so majestic. In some parts of Scandinavia, archaeologists found graves where warriors were buried standing upright, as if refusing to lie down, perhaps a symbol of eternal vigilance. In others, people were buried with large stones placed on their chests, a precaution to keep restless spirits from walking after death. These details remind us that fear and reverence were never far apart in the minds of the ancient people. Farther south, across the sea, the ancient Celts had their own peculiar ways of honoring the dead. In France, a 5th century BCE tomb known as the Lady of Vix held one of the largest bronze vessels ever found, a massive crater over 5 feet tall, used for mixing wine. This single object might seem extravagant, even ridiculous, but it reflected the Celtic belief that feasting was a divine act, a ritual that connected the living and the dead. To send a noblewoman into eternity, therefore, they gave her the tools for an eternal banquet. Celtic burials also revealed curious objects like chariots, mirrors, and even cauldrons filled with food offerings. Some graves contained strange imported goods, Greek pottery, Etruscan jewelry, suggesting that the Celts saw the afterlife not as isolation, but as a continuation of the world's great exchange. In death, as in life, trade, status, and beauty still mattered. In Roman Europe, meanwhile, tombs ranged from elaborate mausoleums to simple catacombs carved deep beneath the earth. The Romans were both pragmatic and deeply superstitious about death. For them, maintaining peace with the dead, the manes, was a civic duty. Families offered food, wine, and flowers through small holes or tubes that connected to the tombs. But beneath these solemn customs, stranger practices lingered. In certain Roman tombs, archaeologists have found tiny terracotta dolls, coins placed on tongues or eyes, and even curses etched into lead tablets. One particularly eerie example came from Bath in Britain. Dozens of lead sheets inscribed with requests to the goddess Sulis Minerva, begging her to punish thieves or unfaithful lovers, then folded and thrown into the sacred spring. To the Romans, tombs and temples were equally powerful. Both served as thresholds between worlds. And yet, perhaps the strangest Roman burial artifacts were perfume bottles made of glass, still containing faint traces of oils and unguents. Even in death, the Romans valued fragrance. The belief that scent could preserve dignity, even deceive decay. Some tombs also included cosmetic boxes, mirrors, and hairpins, suggesting that personal beauty was not only for the living, but a kind of armor for the soul's journey. Further north, in the British Isles, archaeologists have found burials from the Iron Age and early medieval period that border on the surreal. In one Scottish grave, a man was buried with the severed head of another person placed on his chest, possibly a ritual meant to capture the other's power or spirit. In another, discovered in Yorkshire, a woman lay beside a bronze mirror and an animal bone flute, as though she might entertain herself in the afterlife. The farther archaeologists dig into Europe's past, the clearer it becomes that death was not simply an end. It was an expression of identity, power, and imagination. People buried what they loved, what they feared, and what they hoped would carry them into eternity. There's something hauntingly human in that impulse, the need to turn death into a story, to make it beautiful, strange, or even humorous. The Vikings with their ships, the Celts with their feasting tools, the Romans with their perfume. Each culture turned the grave into a reflection of life, filled with the odd, the personal, and the sacred. So the next time you hear of a discovery beneath a field, a chariot buried under clay, a lyre hidden in the soil, or a skeleton adorned in gold, remember, these were not just tombs. They were statements about what it meant to live, love, and dream in a world where eternity was only a heartbeat away. Section 11. The Tombs of the East, Miniature Worlds and Eternal Companions. When we travel eastward, past the deserts and mountains, into the ancient heart of China and Japan, we find tombs unlike any others in the world. Here, death was not simply a doorway. It was a continuation, an entire replica of life built beneath the ground. The ancients of the East did not only bury people with possessions, they buried them with entire worlds, carefully constructed to mirror the one they had left behind. Perhaps the most famous of these is the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, who unified the warring states over 2,000 years ago. His resting place, still only partially excavated, remains one of humanity's most astonishing archaeological mysteries. When the emperor died in 210 BCE, his architects built for him a vast underground palace, a city beneath the earth that mirrored his empire. They surrounded his tomb with rivers of mercury, representing the celestial waterways that separated the mortal realm from the heavens. Above his chamber, they are said to have placed a map of the night sky, embedded with pearls to mark the stars. But it is what guards his tomb that made history gasp: the terracotta army. In 1974, farmers digging a well near Xi'an stumbled upon fragments of clay that turned out to be parts of life-sized soldiers, and soon archaeologists realized they had uncovered an entire army of over 8,000 figures, each one unique. Soldiers, archers, charioteers, horses, every face distinct, every posture frozen in silent vigilance. These were not mere ornaments. They were protectors, crafted to defend the emperor in the afterlife, just as real soldiers had guarded him in life. And this army was only part of the larger tomb complex. Excavations revealed terracotta musicians, dancers, acrobats, and officials, as though the emperor had brought with him every form of entertainment and administration he would need for eternity. The tomb, in essence, was a perfect reconstruction of his empire, a miniature universe of loyalty, power, and art, all made from earth and fire. Yet China's funerary traditions extend far beyond this monumental spectacle. Across centuries, families buried their loved ones with model houses, farms, animals, and servants made of pottery or bronze, known as mingqi, or spirit objects. These were not intended to deceive the dead into thinking they were real, but to spiritually substitute for the real thing, allowing the soul to enjoy comfort without depriving the living of their possessions. Some tombs contained tiny stoves, wells, granaries, and pigs, while others included musical instruments and writing tablets, suggesting that the afterlife was expected to be peaceful and cultured, not merely a continuation of labor or war. But within these peaceful offerings, there were moments of strangeness too. In several Han Dynasty tombs, archaeologists discovered wooden figurines with detachable heads, sometimes carved to represent servants, sometimes guardians. Scholars still debate whether the separable heads symbolized rebirth, transformation, or protection from evil spirits, but the effect is undeniably eerie. Imagine a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, filled with hundreds of smiling, painted figures, each waiting in perfect silence for their master's return. In Japan, too, ancient burial customs took fascinating and sometimes haunting forms. During the Kofun period, 3rd to 7th century CE, nobles were buried in massive mounded tombs shaped like keyholes, some large enough to be seen only properly from the sky. Surrounding these tombs were terracotta figures called haniwa, simple, cylindrical at first, but later evolving into elaborate shapes: warriors, priests, horses, houses, and even musicians. These haniwa were both decoration and protection. Their purpose, it is believed, was to guard the tomb and to symbolize the transition between the world of the living and the dead. Their blank, almost expressionless faces gave them an aura of serenity. But if you stand before one today, in the quiet of a museum or the mist of an ancient burial site, there's something uncanny about their calm. It's as if they're watching both this world and the next. The haniwa also reflected a remarkable emotional subtlety. Unlike the fierce terracotta warriors of China, these figures often appeared gentle, reflective, and oddly peaceful, mirroring the Japanese belief that harmony and balance must be preserved even in death. Other tombs in East Asia reveal yet more curiosities. In Korea, for example, noble burials from the Three Kingdoms period often contained gold crowns that glittered with intricate branches and jade beads, not symbols of earthly rule alone, but representations of the tree of life, connecting the human soul to the heavens. And in some regions, archaeologists found tiny clay horses and boats, placed beside the dead so their spirits could travel swiftly across the landscape of the afterlife. Just as in Europe and Egypt, the metaphor of the journey appeared again, but here it was quieter, more poetic. Even the smallest details tell a story of longing and imagination. Chinese tombs sometimes included miniature kitchens and servants cooking meals, as though to comfort the dead with the warmth of familiar smells. Some tombs even contained little figurines of children playing, or pets curled beside their owners, carved lovingly from jade or clay. These were not grand offerings of power, they were acts of tenderness. In all these Eastern tombs, one theme shines through: the belief in continuity. Life did not end abruptly. It flowed like a river into another realm, and every tool, every companion, every comfort might help carry the soul onward. It is this quiet conviction that love, art, and beauty can outlast death that makes these ancient burials feel so strangely intimate. The hands that shaped the clay, the minds that planned the tombs, the families that wept and placed those final offerings, all of them believed deeply that what they made would endure forever. And in a way, they were right. Because here we are, thousands of years later, still walking through their silent cities beneath the earth, still touched by their artistry, still whispering their names in awe. Section 12. Tombs of the Middle East. Perfume, gold, and the breath of eternity. The Middle East, cradle of civilization, birthplace of gods, and the keeper of 1,000 forgotten souls. When we step into its tombs, we enter a world that was never content to separate the sacred from the sensual. Here, death was not seen as cold or still. It was fragrant, shimmering, and alive with symbols of eternity. Among the earliest of these burial cultures were the Sumerians and Akkadians, whose tombs tell stories of divine rulers who walked with gods and governed cities that gleamed with lapis lazuli and gold. Archaeologists excavating the royal cemetery of Ur in modern-day Iraq found something both magnificent and unsettling. The tomb of Queen Puabi, sealed around 2500 BCE. Inside her tomb lay delicate jewelry of carnelian and gold, headdresses woven with precious stones, and musical instruments made of silver and shell. Yet it was what surrounded her that froze time. An entire retinue of attendants, perfectly arranged, who appeared to have been sacrificed to serve her in the afterlife. Some still wore their jewelry and held cups, as if waiting to toast their queen one final time. Beside them lay harps and lyres, their strings long since vanished, but their forms intact, adorned with the faces of bulls. These weren't just decorations. They were symbols of strength and life. The musicians, like the guards, followed their queen into eternity, perhaps believing that music itself could guide the soul through the long shadows of death. Further west, in ancient Egypt, this union of beauty and belief reached unparalleled heights. Egyptians saw death not as an end, but as a passage, a continuation of the great rhythm that governed all creation. And to make that journey safely, one needed to be prepared. The tombs of Egypt are among the most elaborate ever created by humankind. Corridors of painted stone, filled with food, clothing, jewelry, chariots, and scrolls. Yet beyond the treasures and splendor lies something even more fascinating: the scent of immortality. Perfume played a sacred role in Egyptian burial. Archaeologists have found tiny alabaster jars still clinging to their fragrances after 3,000 years, a mixture of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and lotus oil. These perfumes were believed to please the gods and purify the body for its journey into the next world. When the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened in 1922, the scent of ancient resins reportedly lingered in the air, faint, sweet, and strange, as though the young king's soul had left behind a whisper of eternity. Within his chambers lay objects of every kind: sandals made of papyrus, golden chariots, ornate beds shaped like lions, and even a board game called Senet, a pastime that symbolized the journey from life to death. It wasn't just royalty who sought to prepare their tombs with care. In smaller burial sites, common Egyptians were also buried with modest versions of these objects. Figurines known as ushabti, little workers made of stone or faience, meant to come alive in the afterlife and labor on behalf of their masters. Some people carried these like tokens of comfort, believing they could rely on their tiny helpers in eternity, as they did in life. Beyond Egypt, in the lands of Persia, Babylonia, and Assyria, tombs often reflected a blend of earthly grandeur and celestial hope. The Persians, who worshipped Ahura Mazda, the god of light and wisdom, practiced unique forms of burial, sometimes using rock-cut tombs high in cliffs such as those at Naqshi Rustam, where kings like Darius and Xerxes were laid to rest. Their tombs were carved directly into the mountain face, their entrances shaped like crosses, their walls engraved with reliefs showing the kings standing before fire altars, eternal flames that symbolized truth and divine order. Unlike the Egyptians, the Persians did not mummify. They believed the body should return naturally to the earth, or be left for purification by the elements. Yet even then, they filled their resting places with gems, weaponry, textiles, and inscriptions, testifying to a life of majesty and purpose. Farther north, the tombs of ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia revealed yet another layer of wonder. Some graves were lined with bowls of honey and beer, offerings for the soul's nourishment. In others, small clay animals or dolls were found, gifts of protection for the departed, perhaps meant to ward off loneliness in the silent years ahead. And occasionally, amid the solemnity, there appear objects that seem almost whimsical: toys, carved combs, amulets shaped like animals, and tiny mirrors of polished bronze. Some scholars believe these mirrors were not for vanity, but for the spirit to recognize itself, a last act of remembrance before joining the unseen. In the Jewish and early Christian tombs of the region, a shift began. Wealth gave way to faith, and the emphasis moved from preserving the body to preserving the soul. Tombs were carved into the soft limestone hills, decorated not with gold, but with symbols: fish, lamps, olive branches, and stars. These were signs of peace and hope, marking a new understanding of eternity. Yet even within these simpler resting places, the deep human need for connection persisted. Fragments of letters, charms, and blessings have been found tucked near the bones, written by grieving loved ones, short messages of love, forgiveness, and longing. It's as though, across thousands of years, people were still whispering the same words: "Don't be afraid, you are remembered." When we stand today in the cool silence of a Middle Eastern tomb, the air still feels alive with those messages. The faint aroma of oils and incense clings to the stones. The murals shimmer with pigments made from crushed lapis and ochre. Time seems to breathe there, not as something that has passed, but as something that continues, infinitely patient. The ancients of these lands believed that as long as someone remembered your name, your soul never truly vanished. And perhaps that is why they built so beautifully, not only to honor the dead, but to ensure that remembrance itself would never fade. Section 13. Tombs of Europe. Warriors, queens, and the mystics of the North. Europe's ancient tombs feel different from those of the East. They are not drenched in sun or painted in gold. Instead, they belong to mists and forests, to mossy hillsides, rain-polished stones, and the eternal whisper of the wind. These are lands where the line between the living and the dead was thin, where burial was not merely a farewell, but a way of keeping the spirit close. Long before the marble splendor of Rome or the cathedrals of Christianity, there were the Celts, the Norse, and countless forgotten tribes who buried their dead beneath earthen mounds, stone circles, and sacred groves. Their tombs were not grand in size, but grand in meaning. Each object, each stone, each carving was part of a silent ritual, a story of belief, courage, and reverence for the mysteries of nature. In the windswept lands of Britain and Ireland, for instance, the Celts constructed barrow tombs, rounded mounds of earth covering chambers made of stone slabs. Inside, the dead were often buried with weapons, jewelry, cauldrons, and food for the afterlife. Some even had small bells or amulets, believed to guide the spirits safely to the next world. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from Wiltshire, England, near the Great Circle of Stonehenge, the burial of the so-called Amesbury archer, dating back over 4,000 years. His grave contained more than 100 objects: flint arrowheads, gold ornaments, copper knives, and stone tools from hundreds of miles away. This was not just a hunter. He was likely a leader, perhaps a priest or warrior of high standing. His possessions hinted at travel, trade, and power, a man who walked between worlds, both physical and spiritual. But not all European burials were so solemn. In some Celtic and Germanic regions, warriors were buried as though they were attending a grand feast. Archaeologists have found cauldrons filled with remnants of food, drinking horns, and carved wooden cups. These people believed the afterlife mirrored life, full of gatherings, music, and the warmth of firelight. To die was not to lose joy, but to carry it elsewhere. Farther north, in the lands of ice and midnight sun, the Vikings transformed burial into something both fierce and poetic. Their tombs were ships, literal vessels for the soul's voyage to Valhalla or other realms of the dead. Perhaps the most breathtaking of these discoveries is the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. When archaeologists opened it in 1904, they uncovered not a warrior, but two women, one older, one younger, laid out in a ship surrounded by rich textiles, carved sledges, wooden animals, and intricate wagons. The wood itself was so finely decorated, it seemed to breathe with art. These women, believed to be of noble or priestly status, were buried with beauty, power, and purpose. Their tomb was not a place of grief, but of awe, a passage prepared for those who carried sacred authority in life. Among their possessions were also small seeds, combs, and fragments of woven cloth, delicate things that spoke of care and ritual. Some scholars think one of these women might have been a Volva, a seeress who practiced prophecy, the one who could glimpse fate itself. The Vikings also buried animals with their dead: horses, dogs, even falcons, companions to carry them on the final journey. In one Swedish grave, a chieftain was found seated upright, surrounded by weapons, shields, and a sacrificed horse lying beside him, as if ready to ride into eternity. Across the cold plains of Eastern Europe, the Scythians, fierce nomadic warriors, also created tombs unlike any others, deep burial chambers beneath massive mounds called kurgans. These were filled with golden ornaments shaped like panthers, eagles, and stags, their artistry so fine that each piece seemed alive. When one such kurgan was opened in Siberia's frozen permafrost, the preservation was astonishing. Bodies still clothed in fur and silk, tattooed with swirling animal motifs, surrounded by feast vessels and chariots. One Scythian prince even had a small mirror of polished bronze, found tucked beside his hand. Perhaps he meant to look upon his own soul before crossing the threshold to the next world. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece and Rome, the dead were surrounded by philosophy as much as by art. Wealthy Romans were buried in elaborate sarcophagi, carved with mythological scenes, heroes, gods, and battles representing eternal themes of love, power, and destiny. But the Greeks, especially in earlier centuries, had a more subtle beauty in their tombs. pottery, painted with images of farewells, a handshake, a gentle gaze between the living and the departed, revealed their deep emotional awareness. Many graves also contain terracotta figurines, perfume vials, and wreaths of flowers, meant to preserve the sweetness of life. Even more curious were the mystical objects found in the graves of certain cults, especially those who followed the Orphic or Dionysian mysteries. In these burials, archaeologists discovered thin gold leaves inscribed with instructions for the soul, how to navigate the underworld, which paths to take, which gods to greet, and what words to speak when standing before Persephone and Hades. These tiny gold tablets, often folded and placed on the tongue or the chest, were like maps for immortality, guides for the restless spirit in the darkness beyond. And then there were the mystic burials of the druids and shamans, scattered throughout northern Europe. In some graves, ancient mistletoe seeds, crystal stones, and fragments of wands have been found. Others held animal bones carefully arranged in circles, or wooden staffs wrapped in cloth, silent symbols of ancient rites we can only imagine. Whether buried beneath ice, stone, or soil, these tombs share a remarkable truth, that every culture, no matter how distant or different, sought to make death meaningful. They filled the earth not only with gold and weaponry, but with the things that defined who they were: art, faith, love, and memory. When you picture a warrior's sword, a queen's comb, or a mystic's amulet lying quietly in the soil for thousands of years, you can almost hear the hum of eternity itself, steady, patient, and deeply human. Section 14. Tombs of the East. Emperors, monks, and the eternal guardians. In the East, death was not merely an ending. It was a transformation, a journey from one state of being to another, a crossing that demanded reverence, precision, and beauty. While the tombs of Europe whispered through stone and earth, those of China, Japan, and beyond shimmered with ritual, a balance of art, belief, and cosmic order. Perhaps nowhere on earth is this more powerfully expressed than in the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified the warring states and built the foundations of an empire that would last for millennia. His resting place, buried beneath a massive mound near Xi'an, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in human history, and one of its greatest mysteries. Surrounding the emperor's central tomb chamber, which, according to ancient texts, has rivers of mercury flowing through a model of his empire, lies an army not of men, but of clay. The terracotta army, discovered by farmers in 1974, is made up of more than 8,000 life-sized soldiers, each with a unique face, hairstyle, and uniform. No two are alike. They stand silently in formation, guarding their emperor for eternity. Beside them are horses, chariots, archers, and musicians, all molded in exquisite detail. Even the soles of their shoes are carved. Their purpose was not symbolic. They were meant to serve and protect in the afterlife, just as real soldiers had done in life. This astonishing creation took hundreds of thousands of workers and years of labor. Some craftsmen, it said, were buried alive within the tomb complex to keep its secret safe. Whether myth or truth, it captures the immense devotion and fear surrounding power in ancient China. But not all Chinese tombs were made for emperors. Across dynasties, nobles and scholars were also interred with great ceremony. Inside their coffins, archaeologists have found silk robes, jade ornaments, painted fans, musical instruments, and small porcelain figurines representing servants, dancers, and pets. One of the most famous discoveries came from the tomb of Lady Dai Qinjui, a Han Dynasty noblewoman whose body, remarkably, remained almost perfectly preserved after more than 2,000 years. When her tomb was opened in the 1970s, her skin was still soft, her hair intact, and even the contents of her last meal could be identified. But what truly astonished historians were the objects buried with her. Lacquered boxes filled with cosmetics, delicate chopsticks, a painted silk banner depicting her soul's ascent into the heavens, and dozens of medical and mystical texts designed to ensure eternal balance between her spirit and body. She was not buried for decay. She was buried for eternity. In Japan, burial traditions evolved differently, shaped by Shinto beliefs about purity and harmony with nature. The great Kofun tombs, built between the 3rd and 7th centuries, were massive earthen mounds, some shaped like keyholes when viewed from above. Within these tombs lay rulers surrounded by bronze mirrors, iron weapons, and clay figurines called haniwa. These haniwa are among the most hauntingly beautiful artifacts of ancient Japan. Simple, hollow figures of warriors, priests, animals, and even houses, placed around tombs to serve as spiritual guardians. Their blank expressions, wide eyes, and serene stillness create a sense of calm, as if they are waiting patiently, forever keeping watch. The idea of companionship in the afterlife was also deeply rooted in ancient Korea, where rulers of the Silla and Gaya kingdoms were buried with objects that reflected both status and faith. Gold crowns glittering like sunlight, glass beads traded from distant lands, and finely crafted horse armor have all been found in royal tombs. Some graves even contained miniature models of homes, crafted in clay, so the dead would never be without comfort or shelter. Farther south, in India, tombs often reflected spiritual ideals rather than royal grandeur. Hinduism and Buddhism viewed death as a passage, not a destination. Thus, while kings might be commemorated with stupas or temples, the truly sacred tombs were often those of monks and holy teachers. In the Buddhist tradition, stupas, dome-shaped structures housing relics, became symbols of enlightenment. Some held the ashes or belongings of revered teachers, while others contained only symbolic offerings, a strand of hair, a piece of cloth, or a bowl once used for alms. These tombs were not about possessions, but about presence, the lingering spiritual energy of a life lived in wisdom. The Ajanta and Ellora caves of India reveal this intertwining of art and devotion. Inside these rock-cut sanctuaries, carved more than 1,500 years ago, rest not only tomb-like chambers, but also magnificent murals depicting the Buddha's life, compassion, and transcendence. The silence of these caves carries the weight of centuries of meditation, prayers, and candlelight flickering across stone. And then there is Southeast Asia, where burial and belief merged with myth. In ancient Vietnam, for instance, archaeologists have found bronze drums buried with the elite, intricately decorated instruments believed to connect the living to the spirits of ancestors. In Indonesia's Toraja culture, the dead were placed high up in wooden cliff tombs, their effigies, tau-tau, carved in their likeness, looking out over the valleys below. These figures were not idols, but guardians, ensuring the spirit's peace and the family's prosperity. Each of these tombs, from China's Eternal Army to Japan's clay guardians and India's spiritual sanctuaries, reveals the same profound truth, that across the East, death was never an absence, but a continuation. It was a bridge between the visible and invisible, between what is lost and what endures. The East did not bury simply to remember. It buried to preserve the harmony of all things. A soul could not rest unless balance between heaven, earth, and the human heart was restored. And so, when you imagine the sealed chambers of an emperor, the silent statues of clay, or the golden crown resting on a darkened skull, remember, these were not acts of vanity, but of longing. Longing to be remembered, longing to remain connected to the world they once ruled, loved, and walked upon. Section 15. The strangest tombs and burials ever discovered. Throughout history, humanity's approach to death has revealed not only our fear of the unknown, but our creativity, our love, and our relentless desire to reach beyond the limits of life itself. From deserts to frozen mountains, from golden tombs to forgotten crypts, archaeologists have uncovered burials so peculiar, so filled with mystery, that they defy both logic and time. One of the strangest of these comes from the Philippines, where in the ancient Sagada region, the dead were not buried beneath the earth at all. Instead, they were placed in wooden coffins and hung on cliff faces, suspended hundreds of feet above the ground. These hanging coffins were believed to bring the soul closer to the heavens, and perhaps more importantly, to keep the body safe from animals and floods. Carved with care, sometimes painted with symbols of birds and mountains, they hang like wooden echoes of those who once walked the valleys below. Even today, the wind whistles through those cliffs like a whispered conversation between the living and the dead. In Scandinavia, the Vikings had their own remarkable customs. Some were buried in ships, not full-sized longships, but smaller vessels filled with weapons, tools, jewelry, and even sacrificed animals or servants to accompany the deceased to Valhalla. One such burial, discovered in Oseberg, Norway, contained the remains of two women, surrounded by carved sleds, ornate textiles, a wagon, and even animal bones. The detail of craftsmanship was breathtaking. The wood carvings alone seem almost alive, curling in elegant patterns of dragons and vines. The Oseberg burial wasn't just a tomb. It was a story carved in oak, a final voyage set in wood and silence. Then there are the bog bodies of northern Europe, haunting, perfectly preserved remains found in peat bogs in Denmark, Ireland, and the Netherlands. The cold, oxygen-poor environment of the bogs acted like nature's time capsule. Some of these bodies, like the famous Tolland man, still have visible eyelashes, fingerprints, and facial expressions after more than 2,000 years. His serene, almost sleeping face carries both beauty and tragedy, for he was most likely sacrificed to ancient gods in a ritual meant to bring fertility or good harvests. These strange, intimate burials show that even in death, people sought to communicate with forces larger than themselves: nature, gods, fate. Across the Atlantic, in Peru, the ancient Nazca and Paracas cultures practiced burial rituals that were both eerie and mesmerizing. Mummies were seated upright in the fetal position, wrapped in layer upon layer of woven cloth, and placed in deep underground chambers known as necropolis pits. Their bodies faced east, toward the rising sun, symbolizing rebirth. Around them lay pottery painted with supernatural beings, and textiles so intricate they seem almost impossible to replicate even today. And in one astonishing discovery, archaeologists found mummified trophy heads. believed to hold the spiritual power of enemies defeated in battle. To modern eyes, these may seem grim, but to the ancient mind, such relics were sacred vessels of strength and protection. The Siberian Ice Maiden, discovered in 1993 in the Altai Mountains, offers another glimpse into ancient beliefs about life and death. She was a Paziric woman, buried around 2,400 years ago, whose body was frozen in the permafrost, along with her horses. A wooden coffin carved from a single log, and vivid tattoos of mythical animals spiraling across her skin. Her burial goods, including silk garments from China and herbs from faraway lands, suggest not only wealth, but the interconnectedness of ancient worlds. She was both local and global, her tomb a small archive of human civilization in miniature. Even within the grandeur of ancient Egypt, famous for its pyramids and mummies, archaeologists continue to uncover peculiar and deeply personal burial finds. One tomb, belonging to a high priest, contained miniature models of bakeries, breweries, and boats, each meticulously carved and painted. These were meant to serve him in the afterlife, ensuring that he would never go hungry or travel alone. Another grave contained a pet baboon, carefully mummified and wrapped in linen, a companion meant to entertain and comfort its owner beyond death. But perhaps the strangest and most moving burials are not those of kings or priests, but of ordinary people, individuals whose final resting places still tell stories that reach across centuries. In Pompeii, archaeologists discovered a couple frozen in an embrace, covered by volcanic ash, their faces turned toward each other in what appears to be a final moment of love. In a Roman graveyard, a young child was found with a pet puppy curled at their feet. In medieval England, skeletons have been unearthed with coins in their mouths, the mythical payment for Charon, the ferryman of souls. All of these burials, strange and sacred, share one unbroken thread: the deep human yearning to make sense of death, to turn it into something more than loss. From mercury rivers flowing through an emperor's tomb, to clay armies standing guard, to bones wrapped in silence under frozen ground, humanity has always sought to build bridges between the seen and the unseen. Each artifact, each offering, each gesture of burial is a small piece of that eternal bridge. And as we unearth these mysteries, thousands of years later, we are reminded of a truth both humbling and comforting: that in every age people loved, feared, and hoped in the same way. The tombs they left behind are not monuments to death, but to life, memory, and the enduring desire to be understood. As the dust of centuries settles on ancient stones and buried treasures, one feeling remains: connection. Those who built these tombs were not so different from us. They too feared being forgotten. They too longed for warmth, for meaning, for a story that would last. And somehow, they succeeded. Thousands of years later, we still speak their names, study their customs, and wonder at their imagination. Each strange object and curious ritual is a whisper from another world, a quiet message that life and death are not opposites, but partners in the same eternal dance. And if we listen closely, beneath the silence of their tombs, we can still hear it, the heartbeat of humanity itself.